Tonight, my guest is Brooks Agnew. He is a featured scientist in the 1997 Wendy Robbins documentary on HAARP called Holes in Heaven. He currently is a consultant to the manufacturing industry, and among many other ventures, he is recently co-authored a landmark publication on the creation of Earth called The Ark of Millions of Years. And tonight he's going to be talking about his book. And Brooks talks about the ancient Mesoamericans described visits from the Shining Ones, possible ETs who may have given them the knowledge of astronomy, architecture, and agriculture. And so he's going to be sharing his thoughts on those topics as well as 2012 and also discussing his book. Welcome, Brooks.
Thank you, Hillary. Good to be here.
Well, it's great to have you. So let's just jump right in. So tell us about your book, The Ark of Millions of Years, and what compelled you to write it.
Boy, that's a big question. About 2001, I met my co-author. She's an archaeologist, and she'd heard me lecture. I forget what the subject was at the time, but she came up to me and said, "I'm interested in writing a book on the creation of the Earth." And I said, "Wow. That's a great subject." But she wanted to combine the science of physics with the ancient archaeology, which I thought was a very unique approach. So it took us about 3 years to compile our two sets of research. I had about 25 years of research in instrumental analysis, and she had 35 years of research in archaeology. And I was amazed at how the ancients had a very good idea of how things worked, not from a scientific standpoint, but from, an empirical, just general layman's description of things. But what we did is we put the scientific explanation to those, and it fit like a glove. The book came out at the beginning of 2005, and within 3 months it was a national bestseller. And I went, holy cow, people like reading this stuff?
So you came up with the idea with this woman. Now, did you actually travel to these places to do your research?
Yes, we traveled there. We took our own photographs. We went to Egypt. We went to Scotland, and we went to Mexico, and we pulled all of the best photographs that we could together. And the books are full of photographs. But the interesting thing is that it actually revealed that the Earth might actually be two different forms of matter occupying the same space at the same time. That was what was really remarkable.
And could you go into that a little bit more?
Sure. It was like a higher vibrational matter coupled with lower vibrational matter. It's sort of like the human body. We're, the peas and carrots that make up our physical body, but we're also this animated kind of energy being on the inside. So we're actually two forms of energy, two forms of matter occupying the same place at the same time. Earth is a lot like that. It appears to be, in its own way, alive.
Mm-hmm. And so why don't we back up for a bit and tell those people listening a little bit about your background, because you have some experience working with NASA, correct?
Well, indirectly. My dad was a NASA engineer, actually contract engineer. He developed the clean room systems for NASA in the 60s. I submitted an experiment to them in 1998, which was a ground-probing radar system that would allow you to find water under the ground. Of course, we used it all the time on Earth to find oil, but I proposed that it could be used on Mars to find water. So they got a launch engine in 2003, and they launched it, and it appears to be working.
So your background, so you have you have a background in physics, statistics, and you have quite a lengthy background in a variety of different topics. And so when you were approached with this book, had you already had an interest in the more metaphysical aspects that you obviously went into because of your work with this particular book?
No, that's the remarkable thing. I was pretty much textbooks and knobs and readouts, and really didn't have, that much exposure to the metaphysical side. But 5 years of writing, and now the book's a trilogy. It's 1,500 pages worth of research on 2012, the harvest of the end times, the origin and destiny of the Earth, and believe it or not, I know your listeners know this. There's a very metaphysical or kind of Indiana Jones aspect to the relationship between the earth and the human being.
And do you care to describe that for us?
Well, it seemed like every civilization that we went to, whether it was Egypt or Tibet or even Mexico, every civilization had a key that seemed to be hidden deep in the earth. To the Mayans, it was deep in caves. They used to love to go deep into the earth, into the caves, to find their answers. To the Egyptians, it was all the underworld, and it was trying to get in touch with conquering your fear and putting the body and spirit into a more eternal mode. To the Egyptians, they were lining up their buildings, their lifestyles with the stars. And with the Tibetans, they had inner earth symbology all over their religion. Tibetan Buddhism, even their stupas were designed to transport the human soul between dimensions.
And how did you get into the dimension? I mean, I just find it fascinating that you come from the background that you come from, and you've kind of transported yourself. I haven't had a chance to actually preview your book, but I am familiar with your work, that you transport yourself into I call it my world, the language that I understand, my listeners understand, of dimensions and, moving into extraterrestrials. That had to be really surreal for you. How did that affect your life personally?
Well, it had big effects on my life personally. It opened up, not just sensitivities, but it opened up my ability to care, to love. It sort of removed fear from my life. And the one thing it really helped me do is learn how to manifest the future, learn how to not control my destiny, but set up the future so that it happened the way that I designed it, just as though I was a creator. And I realized everybody had that skill laying before them. All they needed was a little self-control. And what it boiled down to was I had, reliable 3 decades of experience making measurements with sophisticated equipment. But here I was in my 50s beginning to make sophisticated measurements with my body. And the body became sort of a biological transducer to me. And I learned to quantify those measurements and know when things were right and when things were not going right.
Mm-hmm. And so, as you having a background in physics, did you make a natural transition to quantum physics, or had you already kind of looked into that realm as well?
Well, quantum physics and macro physics are really two extremes, and some physicists are trying to marry the two, come up with one set of rules for both worlds. On the large side, you're trying to predict and understand the movement of planets and galaxies and galaxy clusters and superclusters, the expansion of the universe, travel of light, time, space, that kind of thing. On the other end, you have the quantum physics where you're looking into the molecular forces, either the strong or weak molecular forces or even dimensional forces that seem to appear in larger molecules. And the interesting thing is that our bodies are really capable of comprehending both extremes. Even ordinary people without sophisticated training whatsoever in physics have no problem imagining or even imaging in their minds the creation of solar systems and the most sophisticated, complex organic chemistry without any problem. So the fact that we have that ability means somehow that we're either tied into it or anciently we had some knowledge of it, and we're learning how to negotiate both those worlds again, because we live in both worlds.
Mm-hmm. So let's kind of let's go to 2012 and talk about that for a bit. What do you think is going to happen? What are your feelings about this whole 2012 phenomena?
Well, my feelings are I'm trying to stay objective and look at what all the facts everyone has presented. In the books, we bring forward all of the ancient work that's been done. And you have to think about it for a little bit, because why would a civilization spend a majority of their gross national product to build an edifice that would not be really valuable until 2012, probably 2,000 years after their civilization existed? On the other hand, here we are in the modern day. We're 3 years away from 2012, 3 years and a few months from December 21st, 2012. We're acutely aware that the Mayan calendar ends around that date. We're also aware that other major civilizations, going all the way back to the Sumerians, talk about this end of the age, this Suntella Aeon, where the planet, the solar system, lines up with a specific spot in our galaxy where we are subjected to enormous gravitational forces from a black hole in the center of our galaxy with our sun on the other side of us. And it's a setup for huge conflagration, for geotechnical upheaval, for oceanic misbehavior, shall we call it. And people are really nervous about that. So we're wondering, are we destined to be wiped out? Should we move to the highest part of our country in the middle of the country with a year's supply of food? What should we do? And we realized toward the end of the third book that we had to also insert a message so that people would realize that our consciousness, collectively as a people and individually as a single person, is integrally tied to that destiny. All of these predictions that have been left for us by the ancients are all conditional predictions. We can move away from that future by our own choice and our own behavior.
So if these are Earth changes that are coming due to the gravitational differences, then how explain to people how one person can make a difference as far as consciousness goes. Because to the average, to some people, honestly, I mean, they hear these things, and I'm talking like the blue-collared people, the soccer moms, and they think it's all a bunch of craziness. And, they hear about it, and there's a big movie coming out of Hollywood about it, in a few months. And to them, it's kind of far-fetched science fiction. And so when I've heard, and I've interviewed people and talked to people, and we hear this, we can change it with our consciousness, but how could we change the physical Earth changes with our consciousness if they're going to happen because we're aligned with these gravitational, influxes from the center of the universe? I mean, if the Earth is going to make those changes, she's going to make those changes whether we raise our consciousness or not, don't you think? Or maybe not.
Actually, I don't think that. I'll tell you why. Because I know that the universe, the collapsing of all the energy, all the wave energy in the universe to particles, which is what we see with our eyes. It's about 5.5% of our universe. That is a result of intelligent movement of consciousness. Matter is made by consciousness, which means that the universe is the result of, the mathematical result of, all of the consciousnesses of every sentient being in the universe. The interesting thing is most of those beings are not conscious that they're conscious. And so if you've got a population this large of conscious beings that are manifesting matter in the universe, that have basically stabilized this universe in its existing form, then that population has an average consciousness. And what we have found in small sets, that you can change the consciousness of a person, a room, a community. What happens is the average consciousness of that population shifts. And when it shifts, other effects happen. It rains when it's supposed to rain. People don't get sick. They live healthier, happier, more peaceful lifestyles. And if it was a matter of destiny without anything we could do about it, it would seem very strange that so many races, ancient, present, and even off-world, would be so interested in what is going on this day on this world.
I like that answer. I like the way you describe that. It actually it resonates with me very well. So now let's go into that thought for a minute. I mean, who's watching? What's going on? Because how did you get into the extraterrestrial part of all this?
Well, as I said, you make these measurements long enough, and what happens is you begin to get data that does not fit into your experiment to either prove or disprove your hypothesis. Now, most scientists, especially affiliated scientists, those that are tied to a university or some federal research grant, they throw out that data. They just regularly scoop it off the table and throw it out as unexplained. I chose not to do that. I just included all the data, and what happened was these anomalies began happening with enough frequency that I decided to put some instrumentation together to see if This could consistently be photographed or picked up in some way. So we actually took teams with digital cameras, different brands, at exactly the same moment, standing in a line, photographing in the same direction at the same time, and we all got the same thing. Now, statistically, if you take that as mutually exclusive events, if you take it as permutations, the odds of that occurring are astronomical. It's like 10 factorial. So you have 6 people standing in a line with different brands of digital cameras, all aimed at a mountain. They get a feeling it's time to shoot. They raise their cameras and shoot. With the naked eye, they see nothing. But on all 6 cameras, you see a plasma shape above that mountain that has a distinctly disc-like appearance. All in the same place, 6 different cameras. That cannot be denied.
Was that your first experience with that? That kind of phenomena? Was that your first time?
No. My first experience was, however, that same summer in 2006. I was at James Gilliland's location in Trout Lake, Washington, a supposed UFO hotspot. I was one of the speakers shortly after my book was published. I'd never seen a UFO before. I kind of always wanted to, but I wasn't a UFO hunter or anything. And the very first night I was there, I had a nighttime encounter that I really wrestled with for a long time. I said, gee, that was a satellite. And then I said, no, wait a minute, satellites don't make a left-hand turn. And so, there was a certain amount of fear associated with that I had to come to terms with. And since I've come to terms with that, I've had more regular detections of off-world craft.
So do you think it's a matter of somebody's consciousness shifting to accept that they exist?
That's such an interesting question. Hillary, I ask people all the time, have you seen the International Space Station? No, I've never seen it. And I'll say, okay, well, listen, it's going to come over in about 3 minutes. Why don't you stand here with me, and we'll look up and watch it go over. When they see that craft go over, and it's about the size of Jupiter, tonight the Endeavor is connected to it. When you see it go over, you'll go, holy cow, how in the world did I ever miss that? Ever looked up. It goes over every 2 hours. Now, different latitudes around the planet, but it's going over every 2 hours all week long, all over North America. All you have to do is look up, and you'll see it. You cannot miss it.
I had my own experience recently in Sedona. It's the first time I've ever seen a UFO in my life, and just like you, I've always wanted to see them, but I had 2 experiences in Sedona, which were extremely life-changing. And the first time I think you see something like that, it really changes everything. And so I ask you that question because now that I've had those experiences myself, I find myself looking up more, and I wonder how many people actually take the time to observe and to notice and to even pay attention to some of the differences. So that's an interesting thing. But we were talking about consciousness changing, the events for 2012, and I'm curious if we can actually have those experiences because we accept that into our consciousness and we become aware of it, and then that matter is then therefore in a way, I guess, created because of that too. So anyway, interesting topic, and I'm sure you have lots to share on that. So the 2012 thing, now, did you find that they have the same kind of messages in all different texts, all the different cultures that you explored while you were doing the research for your book?
Yeah, it's basically the same, whether we're talking to Hopi masters or we're talking to Tibetan lamas. Basically, in 2012, we get everything from boom to a shift to the 5th dimension to cataclysms and oceanic upheavals, and we're talking about, tsunamis on the order of 400, 500 meters high, traveling at 300 to 400 miles an hour. It would basically take the first 30 miles of coastline out if something like that happened. These are very cataclysmic events that would be life-altering. All the people that know how to do stuff would be under the water. And we'd find ourselves in a very different world if that happened. But that being said, every single one of those cultures leaves that information for us for a specific reason. Now, they could have just kept it to themselves. They could have said, well, there's no sense leaving that for them. That's 2,000 years in the future. Let's talk about how we're eating and how we can stay warm and how we can have fresh water and cure disease. Let's not worry about those people 2 millennia in the future. Mm-hmm. What we discovered, Hillary, is something that will really blow your mind. It may blow the mind of your listeners, too. When we ask the question, who built the pyramids? Who built those Mayan edifices? Who put together that Mayan calendar using very sophisticated mathematics? And the answer is, it comes back over and over again, we did. We were the ones that built that thousands of years ago. And we built them in such a complicated way that we knew it would stimulate our curiosity to the point where we would investigate those edifices until we knew why they were built. And once we did, it would remind us who we are and why we are here and what we're supposed to be doing.
And so that makes a lot of sense, actually. So do you believe that we've reincarnated now at this time frame to unlock these keys, or do you believe that consciousness actually stays aware of itself throughout all of the different lifetimes with a vague kind of disconnect as far as memory loss with these events, that it does just take something like the pyramids or symbols or something to stir the keys that we look for? Because as you know, I believe I do past life regression therapy too. So as a therapist that works with that, it's interesting because people very easily can go back into the memories that they've had, and then once they open those doors to those memories, things just flood right through. And so it's been my understanding that symbols, and I've traveled to Egypt, I've been to these places as well, and when you see these things, that's exactly what happens. So do you believe that we're all here, kind of as a group together to go through the 2012 gateway, if you will, together?
Well, I look at the population of Earth, and I look at the probability that a population can advance very quickly, and it's actually quite low. If you look at the progress that our society worldwide has made in the last 150 years compared to, say, the last 15,000 years, it is so dramatic that one has to wonder, who in the world invented the wheel, let alone the computer chip, and why is it accelerating at such a rate? It isn't a matter of a crescendo of knowledge. Look at the population of the Earth, over 6.5 billion people living on the planet, more than have ever lived here before. It is virtually impossible that all of those individuals are new here. Some of them are recycled, and some of them come from somewhere else. And we see that in our society. We see people that are born on this planet that are way off balance. They don't understand gravity, let alone the social graces of how things work on this planet. They're way advanced of where we are right now, and they're just primed to do wonderful, great things, cure things, solve the space-time continuum barrier that we're looking at, much like the sound barrier that we looked at in the 50s. Nobody wants to be the first one to say heavier than air flight now possible, or Earth is round, but it is going to happen. Very soon, breakthroughs are going to be made, and it's going to change everything. And when you look at why that's happening and how that's happening, it has to be an accumulation of knowledge built over millennia by these souls as they're living here, growing here, dying here, being reborn here, and where other worlds have passed away, either through supernova events or other cataclysms. Those souls then come here, and now our planet is having this intelligent explosion that is really the attraction of the galaxy right now.
Mm. And so do you believe that our history in this world has been completely changed or manipulated intentionally to kind of get us out of that, evolution of consciousness, if you will? It seems like there's been a lot of things that we've been taught and trained to believe that are, in fact, completely fabricated. What are your thoughts on that?
I couldn't agree more. I mean, I was raised in church. I was raised that, one day we're all going to put on our gas masks and we're all going to go to Armageddon and we're going to fight it out 200 million strong, and Jesus is going to come down and split the Mount of Olives, and we're going to live happily ever after all the wicked have been burned as stubble. You're not wicked, are you? Well, of course not. You're putting money in the pot, so you're going to be with us. And I lived that way. I actually thought that was true. And then I realized that that path is completely fabricated. And we don't have to walk toward that end in violent warfare. We can evolve as a people and rejoin the galactic community from which we came.
And so what about your thoughts on the flood? I mean, I know that, you go back into the history of the earth. And now when we talk about the flood and we hear things about Noah and the ark, and the title of your book is The Ark of Millions of Years, how does that tie into your research? Do you think that perhaps these earth changes happened at that time? And give me your perspective on that time frame.
Yeah, I think that universally there is a legend of a flood, and how it occurred is the fountains of the earth opened up and water came up out of the planet. When we look at the planet, geologically speaking, from space, it looks like it's 3 times its original size. If you shrink it back to a third of its present size, all the continents fit together just fine. If you expand the planet, which is exactly what happens after a planet forms from a large accretion disk, it does one of 3 things. It either explodes, it spits off a moon off of itself, or it slowly expands and cracks and cools and expands and cools, and in doing so slows down and becomes compatible for life. All planets form this way. When it happens, sometimes that crust opens up and lava comes out, water comes out, and that flooded the earth. Now, fortunately, the reason we call the book The Ark of Millions of Years, that's what Noah called his ark. He called his ark the Ark of Millions of Years. And when he arrived here, he told the people that he had just sailed across the cosmic sea. And that those were such profound words that we began to put 2 and 2 together and found that, yes, an earth cataclysm did occur. It occurred when 2 planets merged and became one, his planet and the planet that we're on right now. Can
you elaborate a little bit more? When you say 2 planets?
As it turns out, we call it the union of the polarity. One planet, this higher vibrational planet coming from far across the galaxy, merges with this planet, which is lower matter, we call temporal matter. And as the frequencies synchronize, it's very cataclysmic. They then synchronize, things get stable, and life continues until there is a dissonance between those 2, and they go out of harmony, and they begin to come apart. That separation of higher dimensional matter going back up into the 5th dimension and the regular 3rd dimensional matter staying here is the event that they predict will happen in 2012. That will be cataclysmic. Whether or not we are involved in that cataclysm completely is dependent upon our vibrational frequency.
So do you think that they had access to this ancient knowledge back in the biblical times?
Yes, I do, and I'll tell you why. Because if you look at the universe as one set by itself, step outside the universe and look at our universe, there is no now. If there was a now, we couldn't figure out how it flows through the arrow of time. It means that all distance and all time is 0 inside the universe. So it is possible to comprehend everything. I know it sounds a little paradoxical, but look at it this way. The photon that leaves Arcturus 87 light years away actually arrives here at Earth the instant that it left Arcturus, because it's traveling at the speed of light. Time is 0 for that photon. It arrives at exactly when it left. To us, it looks like 87 years. You see what I'm talking about? It is possible to comprehend the future and the past all at the same time. It's all now.
So in a sense, we're traveling through having the experience of everything with us at the same time?
Yes.
Sort of.
What we're doing is that's the key word is experience. We could know it all, but how boring would that be? What we've decided to do is slow everything down so that it takes us 87 years to experience the light of Arcturus instead of an instant. We are experiencing ourselves as a collective, as source, as all one collective of souls, of individuals. We are experiencing life. That's why we're here.
Mm-hmm. And so moving forward in the quote timeline, when Columbus came to America, and there's all kinds of stories that he had maps, that he knew he was coming, that they had information about what the natives and that they would encounter, would expect. So if Columbus really had access to this ancient knowledge, what was he really doing? Was he exploring the oceans of the earth, or did he have some other agenda?
Well, that's a really good question. Columbus's father-in-law was known as a Knight of Christ, and he actually, as the record goes, possessed a set of scrolls, and these were the original flying scrolls that came out of some of the ancient temples. One is reportedly a Solomon's Temple. Now, there's some question as to whether there ever was a Solomon's Temple. It might have been the temple at Luxor. It's difficult to say, but records were there. And when Columbus came in possession of this through his father-in-law, his next task was to find investors to help him make this journey. He ended up with Ferdinand and Isabella and put together 3 ships. The rest is history. But what a lot of people don't know is there was a visitor on Columbus's ship. And he went with Columbus. Columbus made no wrong turns, knew exactly where he was going. And when he arrived, the visitor got off his boat and did not return to Spain or to Italy with Columbus. He stayed behind.
And the visitor was a human, or it was somebody that was traveling with him, or was it some kind of ET?
That's a good question. Nobody knows. I think if it was an ET,
what do you think?
If it was an ET, the crew would have panicked more than they did already. Probably had a human look, but obviously had knowledge, not just faith, but knowledge of exactly what they would find and when. And they steered by the stars and went to a place supposedly nobody in Europe had ever been before, but they didn't make any mistakes. They went straight there and straight back, and it's difficult to say why they did it, but he certainly opened the trade routes, and whether or not Columbus actually had an agenda is irrelevant at this point, because the routes were taken over and used by others.
And so I know that your work seems to restore the lost knowledge about the origin of the Freemasons even, too. And I know we're kind of scooting ahead, but how did Freemasonry influence the outcome of the Revolutionary War and help America to win against all odds? I know you do talk about this.
Well, that's a huge question. Freemasonry goes all the way back to Adam, maybe before. We call it Freemasonry. It's actually a knowledge of how creation works and the inner keys to it. What had happened was, in European times, they were suffering from extremely dark times. Very, very ruthless leaders had come to power. There was the extremely wealthy, and there were the poverty. There was nobody in between, and there was no hope of ever changing your class. So that there was always this legend, and it was passed up through my family, through the 1200s, to the 1700s, all the way to Europe and into Canada, that one day there would be a land called the New Jerusalem, that it would be formed, that it would allow religious freedom, that it would prosper, that it would rule the world. And all the Freemasons knew this. Now, the interesting thing is the Freemasons crossed over from nation to nation. Lots of British were Freemasons, and almost all the colonial leadership were Freemasons. So when it came time to declare independence from the crown, there were the armies of the British who decided to stay loyal to the crown, and they came over. They had us outgunned. They had us outmanned. They had us outtrained, outsupplied. There is no possible way in the world the colonial army should have won that war. But here's the remarkable thing. The colonial Freemasons and the British Freemasons would not fight one another. One of the stories that we learned, and we put it in the book, was Washington used to have the personal belongings of all the British officers brought to him so he could go through them and divvy them out to his officers when they were in Valley Forge. One such incident happened when they brought a bag to him, and on the bag was a Freemason crest. So Washington asked to see the man, so they brought the British officer to him. He interviewed him. They became friends. He treated him well during the war, and after the war sent him home. And when that British officer retired way back in Britain, became deathly ill and was about to die, he asked Washington to come to Britain to dress him for death. There is a specific way to dress a Freemason before they die, specific clothes, specific rites that are done. And Washington agreed to do that. He went to Britain and he dressed this man for death and gave him his last rites. So when you look at how this pulls together, you see that both armies, the British Army, not the leadership, but the officers, the lower ranks of the British armies, and the colonial army were all pulling for the same thing, and that is this New Jerusalem. And that's why the colonial army was able to win the war and really not devastating losses on both sides. The colonial army was completely broke. They had no money at all, and if it wasn't for the Solomon brothers in Jerusalem, who funneled millions of dollars, and that's a lot of money in the 1700s, millions of dollars to the colonial army, we would have never been America. Washington repaid them by putting all of the Freemason talismans on the dollar bill.
And so moving forward to today, how does all of this play out in the New World Order and in some of the conspiracy theories that are out there, and, how things are, coming out now with Iraq and Iran, the Middle East, and all of that? Do you have any thoughts on how this kind of moves forward into today?
As it turns out, originally, when there were 200 watchers that came to this planet. They're described in Genesis. They're described in Numbers. Other societies call them the Shining Ones. Very advanced teachers that come from far away that come and teach them how to do things like animal husbandry and cleanliness and surgery and even weaponry and social economics. It is believed that these beings were timeless. They were immortals and that they could not die. The flood that occurred, some of them left the planet, then came back after the flood. Obviously, 200 of them cannot stand as gods today. We just wouldn't worship them. We would destroy them and run them off. But they could go underground, and they could teach their ways to others. And what has happened, apparently, is they have learned these methods and brought them to the leaders of the world so that they know how to work the economics of the world. We used to have a whole lot of great currencies in our world. Now we're down to 4. We have the British pound, the Chinese yuan, the euro, and the dollar. And very soon, the dollar is going to consolidate into a united currency for Canada, the U.S., and Mexico. And very soon after that, it's going to consolidate into one currency. This is the goal of alchemy. This is the original teaching of Freemasonry. Now, is it going to be done for good, or is it going to be done for ultimate control? That's where the conspiracy theories come in. Obviously, if everyone thought Jesus was going to come down and rule as a one-world order, certain people would be uncomfortable with that, but the vast majority of people would say, that's okay with us. But if it was somebody like a Rothschild or a Rockefeller or a Bush who's going to be in charge of that New World Order, well, then the conspiracy theories fly, and that's exactly where we are right now. Men cannot have that kind of power. Not yet.
And so where did these shining ones come from?
We're not really sure. The origin of them, they're just called being cast out of heaven. But heaven could be anywhere. It could be in this galaxy. It could be another galaxy. It could be another dimension. It could be very high vibrational beings that develop egos and thus lost the ability to resonate in those higher dimensions and can only resonate in this dimension. Yet they bring all that experience and all that knowledge with them because their biology allows them to live immense lifetimes. To us, would be immortal. We live maybe 100, 125 years. they might live 35,000 years.
Mm-hmm. Now, if all things are consciousness, is it possible for the average mortal person to connect with these memories and with these, beings through consciousness, through meditation or vision, some kind of form of that?
Well, I don't know. I want to believe that. I really do. Maybe I should sit down with you and see if I can figure out where I came from. I don't know. But it feels right, and it doesn't feel too foreign. But I think that's absolutely right. We can remember who we are, and that we're not all about getting from one paycheck to the next. We're not about accumulating all the toys we can get. And we're not even about retirement and grandkids. We're about doing something great. That's what's inside each one of us.
Yeah, because what made me ask that question is we were talking about quantum physics and how matter, manifests itself, and even just through the thought, how it creates matter, and how, we were talking about once we see a UFO, how then we begin to see those kinds of things, and our consciousness becomes more aware of that space. And I'm curious, and I've heard this along the way, if we can go back within ourselves and connect to the Akashic records, to, the collective consciousness, and have all of these answers questioned through our intuition, but because our intuition has been so squashed due to our upbringing, our society, for a number of reasons, people have a harder time even thinking that that's a possibility. And it's my belief that once we believe something is a possibility, we begin to kind of create a strand of energy that takes us off into those places where we can actually navigate, kind of like a spider's web, if you will. And even though we may be on one section of the spider web, all of the other sections of the spider web exist and are affected by our vibration. And so it's just a matter of moving over to that certain part of the web to connect with that vibration. So that's why I asked that question. So it's an interesting trip that you've taken. I mean, your work, your books, and going from your background all the way to talking about things like this. And now I hear you have an expedition coming up next month.
Well, it was going to be next month. These kinds of things, funding is always a matter of manifestation, we'll call it that. When we're putting together a manufacturing facility or putting together a company, it's pretty easy to raise investors and get things together and put your assets in place. But when it comes to an expedition, I'm a little bit out of water, a duck out of water, I guess. It's been more difficult than I expected to raise the money, and very difficult financial times for things like entertainment and exploration. So we've got our sights set on 2010. The reason we have to put it off so far is we're talking about the 86th, 87th, and even 88th parallel, and there's only about a 2-month window from the beginning of July until about the third week in August, and then it starts freezing up again. And there are only 2 ships that can actually make this expedition. They make 4 voyages a year to this region, a 5th if we're very aggressive with our charter. So it's a small window, and it takes a lot of planning. It's about $2 million to take this expedition. We believe that we're going to a place that's never been seen before by anyone by sea, unless it's been a submarine. And if it has been, that had to have been military. And if that's the case, well, I'm sure they're going to give us everything that they learned. If not, then the only solution is to put together a civilian cruise with the right team and put the right consciousness and the right tools and experiments in place and make this expedition. So it's actually coming up much quicker than we think. The summer of 2010, we'll be taking 100 scientists, filmmakers, different kinds of consciousness workers, and we're not going to leave anything behind. There's no turning back. There's no supply ship. There's no rescue ship. Once we leave the dock, we have to have everything with us that we will need to see and comprehend everything that we come across up there.
We probably should clarify for everybody listening what kind of expedition this is. You're going to one of the poles, correct? And what exactly are you looking for?
Well, we're going to a very high place in the Arctic Circle because there's a very, very old legend that there's an opening into the inner Earth up there. Now, at first you might think that's really crazy, and I did too when I first heard it about 8 years ago. I did a lot of research over time, not only space-based data from satellite images looking back at the Earth and infrared and visible and X-ray, but also seismological data from the USGS, that's a geological survey that's tied together by internet around the world. We sort of take a CAT scan of the Earth every time there's a big earthquake, and we're getting better and better at refining the picture of what the inside of the Earth looks like. And Hillary, it doesn't look anything like what we learned in elementary school.
Well, that doesn't surprise me, to be honest with you. What does it look like? What has your research shown you?
Well, what the research seems to indicate is a strong hypothesis that the crust is about 900 to 1,000 miles thick, very dense. Trapped inside of it is molten material. It is the vast majority of the gravity of our planet. Inside that crust is an open area between 800 and 1,200 miles, and in the center of the Earth, inside that air dielectric, is a very dense crystalline iron core. That core is rotating at the original speed of the Earth, while the crust, due to conservation of momentum as it's expanded and cooled, is moving much slower. That counter-rotation creates the magnetosphere that shields our planet, allows us to live on the surface. If it wasn't for that, the surface would be sterile. And it's evident, I'm also have a degree in biology. I can tell you wherever there is space on this planet, there will be life. Now, I don't know if the life will be microbial, it'll be complex sea life, or if it'll even be civilizations living in there. Hard to tell, impossible to tell, unless we make the voyage. So that's why we're making the voyage. Many people on this expedition feel as though they're led to do this. I'm trying to stay objective as a scientist and say we have a hypothesis. We're going to prove it or disprove it. Either the Earth is hollow, and there's an opening above the Arctic Circle, or there isn't. And that's what we're going to look for.
And just out of curiosity, what happens when you get there and you find it? Are you prepared to, explore down into it or come back at another time or just to document it? What are your thoughts if you do find something?
Well, we're going to document it. We can't take, obviously, a nuclear-powered icebreaker into the interior of the Earth. But there is a helicopter on the ship. There's another boat on the ship, and we will explore what we can. The idea is that if we get ourselves there, of course, we're going to be broadcasting live film from the ship over the net, and we'll also bring back all the footage, and believe me, we'll be shooting all the Discovery and History and National Geographic channels we can get out of it, as well as some feature films. But the world will see what we see, and if there's an opening there, we'll be back.
Something tells me that's the truth, and I can see that, and even another book coming out of it too, actually. So, what's your own personal curiosity about this? Do you think now Hitler and the Nazis actually are claimed to have gone into those areas and those regions and done a myriad of things? And has your research led into any of that area?
Well, we've read everything we can get our hands on, and of course, those stories exist that the Nazis made expeditions there, that they made inroads in there, and that they're actually their descendants are living in there. We've also heard about inner cities like Telos and characters such as Adamas and Mikos and all the channeled information that comes. And we sort of take it all in stride. We don't, as I say, throw any data out, but without hard evidence, and I'm talking about saltwater measurements that show that there's an inner sea bleeding through the crust into our sea, unique marine life, crystallinity, salinity, chemistry differences, magnetic anomalies, those kinds of things that can actually be documented, and of course film. If we put those kinds of data together, when we come back and we make our presentation, it will be irrefutable.
Mm-hmm. And so your time frame for this, you said, was 2010?
Right.
Is that when you actually leave to go to do this? And how long of an expedition is it?
It's 15 days. We leave Murmansk, Russia, stop off in Helsinki, Finland, and then we take off into a wilderness that's never been sailed before. It's been covered by ice until 2007, and due to global warming, it opened up, so it's able to be explored by sea for the first time in history. We'll be the first ones there.
Are you selling tickets? I can do my show from the boat, you know.
When we originally put it together, we thought about, well, we'll just raise the money by selling seats. And the seats were expensive, about, $22,000 a piece. Mm-hmm. The problem is that we were quickly building a roster of rich tourists. We didn't have any scientists. We didn't have any filmmakers because none of them could afford the price. So we decided to refund all their money and start over again. And now we're trying to actually raise capital to fund the expedition so we can put the right scientists in place. We've spoken to scientists at Washington University, at Stanford, Harvard, MIT, lots of interest in joining. Of course, we'll have to grant them passage, but we want to put together as legitimate mainstream science team as we can, along with exopolitical and even consciousness workers, because there are effects to the human consciousness that occur on expeditions like this. We want to document those, and we even want to experiment with those while we're gone. You mentioned what happens if we find the opening and it's just sitting there static and we're on one side and it's over there, and are we going to sail into it? Maybe the bigger question is, what if something comes out of it to see us because we're there?
Do you think that that's possible?
I don't count anything out. I can tell you this, we'll be prepared to film it. Wouldn't it be terrible if they did, and the leadership, namely me, would say, oops, we forgot to prepare to film something coming out? Of course we're going to be prepared to see that.
Well, I have a very good feeling about the trip, actually. It sounds really, really interesting, and I wish we had more time to talk about your contribution to the HARP documentary that you contributed to. So maybe we'll have to bring you back on, because that's one of my I have a very big interest in that project and that film, and I would love to have you come back on and talk about it. Lots of material covered tonight. Everybody listening, if you would like more information or to order his book, his website is arcofmillionsofyears.com. Other websites are phoenixsciencefoundation.org and globalgreencars.com. And all of these links can be found on my website if you're interested in more information about Brooks and his work. And you are also a frequent guest on Coast to Coast, so you're around there and your information is getting out. And I have a feeling we'll have you back on to talk about some of the other great things you're doing. And I'd like to thank you very much for joining me tonight. It's been a pleasure talking to you about all of these great things, and I feel like we could go on and on for a few hours, actually.
Well, I think we could too, Hillary. I've enjoyed myself. Thank you very much for having me on.